So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to In the Adirondack Library. We're so glad you could join us, and we hope that the new year has found you rested, restored, and ready to settle into some great conversation. My name is Liz Bellier. I'm the Public Programs Manager at the Adirondack Experience Museum on Blue Mountain Lake. The Adirondack Experience Library is the largest and most comprehensive repository of books, manuscripts, maps, photographs, and government documents devoted to Adirondack history. Through this series, we invite you into the library stacks, into the people, places, and lively conversations that have helped shape life in the North Country for generations. In the Adirondack Library runs from October through May on the first Monday of each month. You can find upcoming dates and speaker details at theadkx.org. And we are also so pleased to be continuing our partnership with North Country Public Radio and to welcome back Mitch Teich, station manager at NCPR and host of North Words. Mitch's conversations remind us that the stories of the North Country have the power to inform, entertain, and stir the imagination. North Words airs on the fourth Friday of each month from noon to 1, and past episodes are always available on the NCPR app. And tonight, we are truly honored to welcome Sandra Weber, a hiker, historian, and author. Sandra's passion for writing was sparked by her passion for these mountains, their forests and meadows, their rivers and lakes, and the deep well of legend they hold. She is the author of numerous magazine articles and several books. And in 2003, Sandra completed her own Adirondack Rite of Passage, becoming 46er number 5,227. Tonight's program centers on her latest book, John Brown in New York, The Man, His Family, and the Adirondack Landscape, which is available now for purchase. With passion and sound scholarship, Sandra offers a fresh and intimate portrayal of John Brown and his time in his favorite place, the Adirondack Mountains. By focusing on Brown's relationship with his family, she reveals a fuller, more human understanding of a man often only known through his public legacy. In just a moment, I will turn things over to Sandra to introduce her book. Mitch will then guide tonight's conversation, and afterwards we'll open the floor to your questions. Please submit questions using the Q&A feature and keep an eye on the chat for helpful links throughout the evening. So for now, just settle in and enjoy tonight's conversation. Without any further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Sandra.
Thank you, Shelby. And I'm so glad that we are having a virtual event tonight because it's been snowing all week here and it's about 14 degrees outside. So it's wonderful that everyone is joining me and that we don't have to drive today. So thank you very much. I also want to thank the Adirondack Experience very much for hosting this program. And as Shelby mentioned, they do have an absolutely fantastic library there at the Adirondack Experience. And it just reminded me that really my whole foray into researching and writing history began in the room at the Adirondack Experience library there. And I started reading historical papers and I haven't stopped researching Adirondack history ever since. So thank you to that great resource. And tonight I'm here to talk about my latest book, John Brown in New York, The Man, His Family, and the Adirondack Landscape. This book covers basically the time period from 1849 to 1863, the years that the Brown family lived in the Adirondack region, particularly in the town of North Alba, which today that region is basically known as Lake Placid. So they were there for a while, and it's very important to put the Brown family into their time and place, and that's one of the things I concentrated on. John wasn't actually there at the farm very much. He was away traveling for various reasons, but he always considered it his home. He loved the North Alba and he wanted to be there as much as he could. And when he was away, he always wrote about how much he missed it. So they first moved to the Adirondacks in 1849, and they lived in a rental house in the Flanders Farm, which is down the road from what today most people know as the John Brown Farm Historical Site. So they didn't live there initially. They lived at this rental house down the road. And after a few years, they moved to Ohio for a couple of years for business reasons. But then they moved back to the Adirondacks in 1855 into a new house, which is the house that is at the now historic site in North Alba. And John, of course, almost immediately, John was off to Kansas, and Mary and the children were in North Alba. And by 1858, John was beginning to plan and execute his Harper's Ferry plan, for which he is famously known for trying to end slavery and attacking Harper's Ferry with 21 men. And of course, eventually they were captured, and he was tried and spent a month in prison and then was hanged by the state of Virginia. His body was brought to the John Brown farm for burial, and that occurred on December 8th of 1859. And even after the burial, the family stayed at the farm for several years, but now they were really celebrities. As you're going to learn, they were really plain, common farming people. But suddenly they were these national celebrities, and things were a little difficult in North Alba, and they finally all decided to leave North Alba and try to start a new life, some in California, some in Ohio. So that's the basic overview of the time frame of 1849 to 1863. And now we can get past that, and let's get on to how did this come about? How did I decide to write this book? And for me, I've always been very interested in women's history because there's a lot of stories there that haven't been told. And I became very interested in Mary Brown, John Brown's wife, because she was the one who was at the farm most of the time, taking care of the farm and the children and such. And I started researching Mary Brown back in the 1980s and kept thinking I was going to write about that. In the meantime, I moved up to the Adirondacks, and I started going to the farm a lot more and realized that there was a bigger story here than Mary Brown. I became associated with John Brown Lives, which is a now Friends of the Farm group, which holds a lot of programs at the farm and bring a lot of people, speakers, scholars to the farm to talk. And one of those people I write about in the introduction to the book was Dick Gregory. And Dick Gregory made a very big impression on me. One of the things he said is, "You have John Brown." And that really stuck with me, that sometimes in the Adirondacks, we don't really realize that we have John Brown. We have the mortal remains of John Brown. We have the soul of John Brown. We have his farm. We have his grave. And I realized that no one had really told that story and the whole Adirondack aspect of John Brown and his family. And so I decided that maybe I should look into that more. And I started researching that more and realized that there was really this whole human side of John Brown that could be seen by looking at his family and his time in the Adirondacks. I also realized that much of the research, much of what had been written out in historical books and more current books, actually had a lot of misinterpretation, a lot of presumptions, a lot of just actually wrong, incorrect material in it. And a lot of the stories had just been repeated throughout history over and over again without anyone really going back and checking out the facts. And so that disturbed me. I wanted to tell the truth. I wanted to tell what had been missed or what had been ignored. And so I really became very passionate about this and decided that I needed to pursue this. Because what I came to realize is that you can't really understand what happened in Kansas and Harper's Ferry unless you understand who John Brown is. And a big part of who John Brown is has to do with those final years in the Adirondacks. So this kind of is how I came to write about the man, his family, and the Adirondack landscape, because it's about the man. I wanted to tell about the human side of the man that he's actually a very common, poor farmer, but he has extraordinary principles, extraordinary dedication to duty, extraordinary belief in God. His family is often misunderstood, I think. There's this perception that his family was just following him and doing what he commanded them to do. And when I look at the actual letters between the families and what was said at the time and what they were doing at the time, the way they lived day to day, I realized that they weren't following John. They had their own beliefs, their own convictions, and they lived by those principles, and they willingly sacrificed, which I think, if you read the book, it will really come through their enormous sacrifice for what they see as their duty. The Adirondack landscape. There's a lot there in terms of no one had really told the stories of what did their neighbors think of them. How did they interact with their neighbors? What was the political environment in North Alba? And also that they actually enjoyed living in the Adirondacks for the most part, that on days like today, they went skating and sledding and all the things we do today. In the summertime, they went berry picking. They went on hikes up mountains, up Whiteface and Algonquin. And so there's also this whole kind of, they said that they actually had Essex fever, that they loved living in Essex County and the environment of the Adirondacks. So I'm going to jump right to the end here and just say my conclusion is kind of that the Brown family does not fit into any model. And a lot of times historians try to label them, fit them into something that they don't fit into. For example, they don't even really fit the label as typical white abolitionists. They are much more in tune with Black abolitionists at the time. The Browns don't join the anti-slavery societies or the abolition societies. They are more a total belief in that Blacks are not inferior, Blacks are equals, and they live and pray and go to school and hire and associate with Black people much more than their white neighbors. They are, in a sense, independent thinkers. And their principles come from the Bible, the golden rule of do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and the Declaration of Independence, specifically, all men are created equal. And so I think this story, this time period, this book is very relevant to today. It's an inspiration for me today because these are very poor, common people living a very simple life, but they are lived by principles, by morals, the belief that all people are created equal. And surprisingly, they live in this remote kind of wilderness up in the middle of nowhere. And yet they change American history. I think I'm going to leave it right there, Mitch. You need to unmute. Yep.
Sorry,
Okay.
yes, the mouse wasn't cooperating with me. You won't exactly leave it right there because I have a lot of questions, and I suspect the more than
Okay.
100 people who have joined us this evening will have lots of questions. And I'll encourage people, don't feel like you have to sit on your hands until we open the floor for questions. Drop your questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to them as we can, especially as Sandra Weber talks about various issues that might connect to the questions that you have. But I wanted to start with just kind of a question that I think pays heed to the fact that a lot of this work that you have pulled together hasn't been pulled together in this way before. Why do you think this more personal story has been overlooked for so long?
Well, I think it's been overlooked, first of all, because like this isn't a big population center or something. This isn't Boston or Philadelphia where the main abolition story is going on. I also think like maybe this aspect of John Brown hasn't been talked about so much. Maybe just because people want to concentrate on Kansas and Harper's Ferry, and they don't necessarily, so they make these conclusions without really, to me, knowing the fuller story of his life. That these principles, like he didn't just make them up all of a sudden once he's in jail in Harper's Ferry. Like these are the principles that he and his family have been living by for years.
Well, and to that end, what do we know about how John Brown developed these strong morals and arrived at, what was a fairly uncommon way of looking at equality in those days? What was it about his upbringing? What was it about his early life that that led him to be the guy that he was?
Well, I think it developed over time. I mean, from the very early days of him, like in Ohio, he is seeing, right, a slave boy, and he's seeing how he's being treated, and he just doesn't feel this is right. This is my friend. This person's the same as I am. Why is he being treated differently? So when we say the golden rule, it like sounds like this big thing, right? Or the Declaration of Independence, it sounds like these glittering words or something. But to John Brown, these words like actually meant something, right? And he applied them to meaning. And I think and it was poor people in general. It was oppressed people, poor people, right? Treat everyone as equal and treat everyone as they came to be. And I think this really grew over time as you see the 1850 slave law come into effect. And now, uh, people in the North have to like help capture, right? Runaway slaves. And this is ridiculous. And and then you have the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is saying, oh, we're going to forget about the old laws and the old rules about preventing the expansion of slavery. And now we're going to let new states decide whether they can be slave states or free states. And then you have the Dred Scott decision coming along, which basically says Black people have absolutely no rights. They're not citizens. White people rule. And so this is developing over years and years. And so I think he becomes more and more radical over the years. And I think what surprises people is to really realize that he never actually picks up a gun or a sword or does anything until 1856. He's in Kansas for like 9 months before anything happens.
Well, let's talk a little bit about his relationship to what was at the time that the Browns settled in North Elba, still kind of developing Black community in that part of the Adirondacks, one that never got as large as some people would have hoped. But we have a question from Judith who wants to know a little bit more about the Browns' relationship to the settlement of Timbuktu.
Sure. So that's the real reason, the main reason that they moved to the Adirondacks is that Gerrit Smith had given land of about 40 acres to free Blacks who were living in New York State who wanted to come and develop the land. The land was basically nothing. It was 40 acres of woods for the most part, and they would have to make a farm there. And so John Brown came to help them because they were being scammed by some people. So he was a surveyor, so he could come and help them survey the land and do whatever. He knew how to farm, he knew how to breed, he knew how to build whatever. So he could come and help them, and that's what he did. And so there ended up being about maybe 20 of these families, Black families who settled in North Elba throughout the time that the Browns were there. So he helped them a lot, but like to kind of show you this egalitarianism of the Browns, the very first day that they arrive in the Adirondacks, a fugitive slave, Cyrus Thomas, arrives at their door, And the Browns welcome him in, hire him, and he lives with them. And so now there's 10 people living in this tiny little house. And so this is the kind of people that the Browns are. And an abolitionist, Richard Henry Dana, happens to stop by their house a little while later. And he's completely shocked that the Browns are having the black men and women seated at their dining table with them, calling them Mr. and Mrs. and you know, having conversation, treating them with respect. And so here's Dana, this white abolitionist, but he's shocked at this behavior. So it just goes again to remind you of the thinking of that time. Was really amazing that even this abolitionist couldn't see that blacks should be treated socially equal. And I guess one thing that surprised me there also is that Dana kind of later tells his story and kind of enhances it and makes up some stuff and whatever. But he says, yeah, it doesn't make sense to me. I don't realize why John Brown and I never discussed slavery. And Dana says, I guess it was because the blacks were always present when we were talking. And I thought, wow, so this is an abolitionist who can't even discuss slavery with black people. That's just like shocking.
Yeah, it really struck me the disconnect between, abolition as a theory and abolition as a practice. And that I think that anecdote you told really kind of drove it home for me in everything that you wrote. And this abolitionist, he was from Harvard, as I recall.
Yeah. And a famous writer. And yes.
Yeah. Right. And his account was printed in Atlantic Monthly. And so,
right.
Yeah. Um, along these lines, Maria wants to know, did John Brown and or his family actually know Garrett Smith?
Well, yes. I mean, well, let me say, they came to know him because of this, the grant, the land grant program. Right. And when John heard about it, he actually went to Garrett Smith's house in 1848. Garrett Smith lived in Peterborough, and he went there to say, hey, maybe I could go and help these people. And what's surprising is people think like John Brown wasn't famous until much later, but when he went to meet Garrett Smith said, oh yeah, I know all about you. So, people in the abolitionist circle knew about John Brown a lot sooner than we think. But of course, Garrett Smith and John Brown came to have quite a friendship, and Garrett Smith became a big supporter, financial and what shall I say, emotional support for what John Brown was doing. A lot of it, of course, done in secret. But yes, John Brown went to Garrett Smith's house several times. As a matter of fact, he went to a conference, an anti-slavery conference that that Garrett Smith was holding on his way to Kansas to gather money and weapons for going to Kansas. Yes.
Kate would like to know, because you mentioned that so much of your work sets out to correct the record or correct sort of later day accounts of John Brown and his time, and she wants to know, what should I disbelieve from Russell Banks' Cloud Splitter book?
Wait a minute. Did you say, what should I disbelieve?
What should I disbelieve? But I'm sure the question, I'm sure we could flip the question around and just have you talk about what's right and what's wrong.
So let me say this. I think Cloud Splitter was wonderful in that it drew a lot of attention to John Brown and what John Brown stood for, and to the Adirondacks and his time here. However, as Russell Banks makes very clear, this is fiction. And I would go even further into say that a lot of times when you read historical fiction, you think that the historical part of it is based on facts. But Russell Banks didn't do that. He merged his imagination with facts, changed facts for how they wanted to be, whatever. And this actually caused a lot of problems for Adirondack historians in the area because they had spent decades undoing the myth of there's an underground railroad at the farm, and the black settlers were fugitives, and they had spent decades trying to undo these myths. And then along came Cloud Splitter, and once again, oh, there's an underground railroad going through North Alba, which there's no reliable evidence that there was. So um, don't believe any historical, I guess, really, don't believe that the history that's in Russell Banks. I'm not saying it's not a wonderful story and whatever, but remember, it's fiction.
And I think now is as good a time as any to note that our next interview in this series is about a book of historical fiction. But
oh, great.
But talk about the disabuse us of the notion that there was an underground railroad passage through North Alba, because I think you're right that as best we know, the closest railroad route, if you will, was a good 40 or 50 miles away.
Not quite that far, but along Lake Champlain, was the main line, and there's really no reason that I can see for that. And again, like coming through Indian Pass or something, there's history's just filled with people getting lost in Indian Pass at that time. So that's not really a good route to be taking. But also that's, well, kind of, I think Dana, again, not to keep hitting on Dana, but Dana kind of promoted that notion, and people took his 1871 account of saying that there was an underground railroad there as truth, thought he was a reliable source, as you would, but they didn't know that his actual journals existed, and there's no mention of any of that kind of stuff in his original journal notes. But it's a great myth, and there are underground railroad myths, right, all throughout the country. Everyone, kind of wants there to be an underground railroad here, but that's not what, the whole land grant program was about, which I think is actually fascinating, because we talk a lot about John Brown and the anti-slavery aspect, that he believed slavery was a war and slavery was evil, and he was all about fighting slavery. But again, there's this other part that he goes further, right? And he believes in social equality. And so Timbuktu, which he named, or one of the settlers named with him, as far as we can tell, that Timbuktu is about elevating the conditions of free blacks. And that's one of the things that I love that, I got to tell in this book is also that aspect of what's happening with free blacks at that time. Because we don't normally think of there being free blacks who were born free in places like Virginia, like Willis Hodges, who came up to Franklin County. And so I think that's a very interesting and kind of new aspect that we didn't think about before.
Is it that Mary Brown's story had such a strong pull on you, and maybe before even John Brown's story did?
Yes, it did. I was really the pull of Mary Brown, because, as I said, she was there. She was the one living there, taking care of the farm, raising the children, dealing with the daily activities, birthing babies, not at the farm. She actually never had a baby at that farm, although she had 13 babies with John Brown.
Thought that the
But
law of averages would say that she would have had at least one at the farm.
well, she was kind of done by that almost. She had one while they were in Ohio. So, but back to what I'm supposed to be answering, which was
Well,
oh,
it
yes,
happened that you heard about her story so early in the process.
Because and that was really because of Ed Cotter, who was the caretaker at the farm at the time, and he recognized that story, and I became very interested in it, and realized the importance of Mary, and not only the importance of Mary in why that farm is there today, because the farm's really there because of the grave. And that grave, John Brown's grave, wouldn't be there if it wasn't for Mary, because all of the abolitionists wanted to take his body to Boston and bury it at Mount Auburn Cemetery, where, there would be this big hoopla and they'd put up a monument and, everybody would come there. And Mary just refused and just said that's not what John Brown wanted. John Brown wanted to be in the Adirondacks. He wanted to be at the family farm. And she insisted that it be taken to North Alba. And they even tried to move it a couple of years later. And again, that didn't happen. So she's really the reason that that grave is there. And when she sold the farm in 1866, she also reserved the graveyard so that, nothing would ever be done to his body and such. And so she reserved that for the family. I also feel that Mary Brown really helped make the John Brown legend, because she stood up, while he was in jail and said, no, he's not insane. I've never heard of his insanity until I read of it in the newspapers. And she really stood by the principles. And even though she never said much, she was a rather quiet, humble woman. She really had a lot to do with the legend.
One of the other details that really struck me from your book was John Brown's parenting style.
Oh no.
He was seemingly a pretty strict disciplinarian, but he was also somewhat regretful about how he treated his children. What can you tell us about John Brown, the dad, especially because he was so often away from his family?
He was. He seemed to be a little stricter with the boys than with the girls, I might say. I think Ruth especially had a very special place in his heart. Though I also have to say he tried to treat the boys and the girls the same. Like the boys had to do dishes and clear the table and all of such things, and the girls had to help pick up rocks and things in the fields at times. So he tried to have this equality. I as far as the punishments, the lashes, again, we have to remember the time and the place. And so uh and also the thing that, I think at least once, John took the lash from the son and said, no, here, let me take the rest of the lashes, because I'm just as responsible as your parent, which I think is a very interesting thing to think about. But I think it was very tender with the children, and they really had a strong family relationship. And again, it wasn't that John necessarily commanded. I like to say, like, John gave a lot of really strong advice. But and this is another thing that I love that the Adirondack stories show, that his family didn't always adhere to his advice. And he just moved on, like that was okay, right? And like he told Henry Thompson, I want my house built of logs, and start peeling the logs now and do this, and maybe you should do this and maybe that. And Henry comes back and says, I prefer not to use logs. I'm going to use boards. And John's like, okay, I just thought it would be cheaper or whatever. So yeah, they don't always do what he advises.
Sure. Pamela has a question about the family, and you touched a little on this, but maybe you could go into more detail. She wants to know, how did the Brown family deal with the celebrity spotlight after John's death? The people who wanted to impose themselves on the family, like selling relics and letters, and really the Brown myth creation.
So a lot of the selling relics and all of that comes a little bit later than the time frame that I'm dealing with. It's kind of after they go to California, like in and yeah, and like Annie herself, the daughter, is actually asked to, like, oh, will you go to the World Fair, like, and stand in the engine house, and like, yeah. But in North Elba, there's more of a situation of, there are people who think that John Brown did wrong, and that he shouldn't been bothering with other people's property, and that you shouldn't have violence outside of what's regulated by the government or approved by the government and such. And so there's a lot of criticism at the same time that there's this great worship by other people, just maybe kind of, the Browns maybe kind of feel is a little over the top, because like, we're just humble, plain, poor farmers, and they appreciate the aid and the sympathy and everything, which comes especially from a lot of Black men and women in cities throughout the country, which is wonderful. But there's also, yeah, like people are fighting over who gets to have John Brown's daughters come to school in their town, right? And they're fighting over that. And and Mary has to just, try to figure out which is the best place to be, and want to take their photographs and put them up for sale, and want to be the one writing their biography. So it's very hard for them to deal with, because this is not what they're used to. And they do get a lot of criticism from historians, because, like, oh, why didn't they get up on stage and continue John's lesson? Why didn't they do this? Why didn't they do that? And again, to me, it's back to, they are who they are. They don't fit the model that a lot of people want them to be of this celebrity, of John Brown's wife, or John. They think that there's things that they should be doing, but it just doesn't fit the people that they are. And that's what I was trying to show, you know, who they are. And yet, if you turn that around, as I was saying at the end of my message there, that's actually quite remarkable too, in that these very simple, principled people can have such an impact on the whole nation.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and in those days, I mean, they didn't have a publicist, they didn't have an agent, so expecting them to be gracious and handle the notoriety in a way that we would imagine doing it today, it seems like a little unrealistic.
Yeah, and it's the same kind of thing of like, oh, why don't you have a nicer dress?
Yeah.
Right? Why do you sip tea from your saucer? Right?
Um, Mike wants to know, did John's wife or kids try to talk him out of doing the Harper's Ferry raid? Did he really think he could get away with it, or was it a form of suicide?
Oh, well, the second part there is getting something a little different, but let me talk about, so the family. So I don't know that, the family ever, obviously Frederick Douglass didn't go along with it. The Secret Six, Garrett Smith, and some of the other ones didn't necessarily think it was a great idea, but they said, hey, he's going to do it. We might as well support him. Now, when the Raiders were in the house in Maryland, and as I understand, at some point, they all kind of, as they heard more of the actual little details, decided, hey, I don't really think this is a great idea. And they, discussed it with John, and evidently it was a kind of heated debate. And John Brown walked away and said, okay, you guys, you talk it out, and, you decide whatever, which, of course, so three of John's sons were there. And in the end, the Raiders all decided, yes, we need to do this. We need to do this. As many of them said as they joined or put in letters, what is our life compared to the lives of millions of slaves? And that's really the point, right? There's this war that's going on. It's called slavery, and it's a sin, and it's wrong, and we need to do something about it.
Yeah. You mentioned that John Brown was a fairly religious man, or spiritual anyway. Neil writes, wondering what religion was John Brown, and were he and his family regular churchgoers?
Well, They were early on, and they were his family was Calvinist, and then he belonged to the Congregational Church for a while. But after a while, he gave up organized religion and really didn't belong to any church, as I say, because part of that was that he didn't see how Christian ministers could approve of slavery. And so he really just kind of stepped back. John Brown himself was a preacher. He went to school early on to be a minister, but he had some health issues and I think maybe some financial issues. And so he had to give it up. But he would preach sermons in North Alba at the schoolhouse served as the church at the time. And he would preach sermons himself. As I say, he really turned away from um, organizations because he found that there was a lot of talk and not talk that he necessarily agreed with.
Um, there are a couple
But
of
there's a great book. I'm sorry, I was just going to
oh,
say
I'm sorry, go ahead.
there's a great book by Lou DeCaro called Fire from the Mist, like myths. That's not
Easy for
Lou
you to say.
DeCaro. Anyway, sorry, Lou, if you're listening. That really has the whole religious aspect of John Brown, if you want to get into that side of it.
There are a couple of just comments that I wanted to include here, just so that you have a chance to hear them. Earl writes, having lived in Kansas for the last 40 years and hearing about the history of John Brown, it's really exciting to learn about his ties to the Adirondacks. I found out a few years ago my ancestors were from the Big Moose area. And he says, thank you for bringing these connections together in your book. Look forward to reading it. And then along those lines, a question from an anonymous attendee. Is it better for people to buy the book from Amazon or from SUNY Press or from someplace else?
SUNY Press, from SUNY Press or your local independent bookstore. Or to invite me to come and do a talk at your area, and I will sell the book and sign it for you. Little self promotion there.
Especially if you'd like to buy the hardcover. Which we're laughing at because it is roughly 5 times the cost as the paperback, I think, right?
Yes.
Neil followed up his previous question, wondering where in Maryland did they meet? Did the Raiders meet?
Oh, where was the house? Oh my gosh. Dang, I can't. Oh, why can't I pull that out of my head? But it was just over the border from Harper's Ferry, just a couple of miles.
Could it have
I
been Cumberland is in area,
I
Hancock? Yeah.
geez, I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank.
That's all right. We won't play Stump the Author.
Well, you
Karen
did.
Karen asks what family members thought of John Brown, and maybe more to the point, how did his being away so much affect who the family members were and became?
Well, I don't want to put words into their mouths, so I can't. I'm trying to think how to answer that. I think they missed him very much. They obviously relied on him when we see about the sons moving to Kansas and the problems they're having there. You see how tight the family is and how they're asking their father, for support there and such. Um, the younger daughter, Ellen, who was born just before John goes to Kansas. So she doesn't see him for like a year and a half. So when he comes home, she doesn't even know who he is. Like, she's kind of afraid of him.
Hmm.
And so I think, they really miss having him, but it also means they wrote a lot of letters. And I think those letters, um, show a lot of how things are happening in their lives and John's regret for not being there. Um, Not sure what else
Well,
to
Jeff
say
Jeff
there.
follows this up with a question about whether you can kind of give us a sense for how much time he really in North Elba during the years that the farm existed. I mean, you mentioned that they lived in a rental house for a while, then moved to Ohio, but then they came back and built the John Brown farm that we know of today. How much time did he actually spend there?
So I think it's been estimated something like maybe like 6 months or something overall. There's, he's there a bit more at the Flanders farm for a few months and then back again showing cattle at the county fair and Ruth getting married. So he's there for several months off and on there. He's not there so much at the actual John Brown Farm historic site after 1855 because he's raising money, he's fighting battles, he's liberating slaves in Missouri. So it's only probably a matter of weeks that he's actually there. He's really not there much.
Valerie asks, in John Brown's absence, did his wife support the free blacks manage in the wilderness, or was she mostly focused on the family?
No, actually, this is one of the surprising things when I really dug into it is that Mary and the daughter Ruth, and they are working daily with uh, Black women, like sewing dresses, gathering berries, cooking things, making butter, et cetera, et cetera. They're all working, doing things together, and they're going to church together. And the men, the boys, are helping the blacks build their houses and chop wood. And so all of this is documented in letters. And so it's the family is absolutely there daily, continuing. And this continues even after John Brown's death of how close they are with some of the black neighbors who, one of the women's living with Henry and Ruth for a while. One of the young men is climbing Whiteface Mountain with the Brown kids. And yeah.
Um, this popped up, I believe, when we were talking about where the Raiders met in Maryland. Judith writes simply the Kennedy Farm, and does that sound right?
Oh, yes, it's the Kennedy Farm. I can't think of it.
Where
The
that is, we
town,
still don't
though.
know.
Yes.
Mike asks if you're planning a book tour so that he can get a signed version. He's in the Albany area.
Yes. I will be in the Albany area for a couple of days. April 12th, I think I'm going to be at the New York State Museum and perhaps at the at SUNY Albany also in the middle of April.
We should
And
mention
then I'm
there's a
headed off.
website for this book that has your whole
Yes, yes.
schedule.
So let me say that. So you can look at sandraweber.com for all of my kinds of information. But for this John Brown subject, particularly, I created a new website called johnbrownny.com.
And there's at least one person on the call. Pamela wants to know or is lobbying for a stop in South Central Pennsylvania.
Oh, well, that works right into my plan because from Albany, I'm going to Rochester and I'm going to Michigan. So I can stop in Pennsylvania. So tell Pamela, yes, contact
Okay.
me. We'll work that out.
All right. Um, Hope asks the question. You mentioned that John Brown derived some of his values from the Declaration of Independence and the principle of natural equality. Can you say more about his belief in natural law and perhaps how his view of nature played a role here?
Yeah. So I'm actually going to pull out a piece of paper here to read something, I think. Part of what part of John Brown's buildup to planning for Harper's Ferry, he wrote a Declaration of Liberty, which is not very well known that he did this because everybody asked, why did he do Harper's Ferry? What was he doing? This document tells, like just lays out, just like follows the structure of the Declaration of Independence and lays out what are the abuses, why we need to take action. And it just lays it out. And And in there, he talks about, you know, the principle of all men are created equal, that we have certain inalienable rights, repeats what's in the doc. But then he adds to that, that beyond life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, he says that nature hath fully given to all men a full supply of air, water, and land for their subsistence and mutual happiness, and that no man has any right to deprive his fellow man of these rights. Who knew John Brown was an environmentalist, right? Or like, so he talks about these natural laws, and not only that, but you know, he adds all men are created equal. Forget about sex, forget about nation, forget about, you know, inheritance. So he believes in in these rights and these duties that you have to your fellow man. He talks about fraternal kindness, that it's your duty to take care of the mental, physical, and elevate the morality of your fellow man. Like, this is incredible stuff that I think is kind of relevant to today.
Certainly pretty progressive for the 1840s.
Absolutely. He sees these fragments and how they're all related. And although he is a very religious, godly man, he also sees that some of these things just are come from nature, right? You look at what Thoreau and Emerson say about John Brown, and it's this, yes, that man's laws are not always to be followed, that there's a higher law, that there's a law of God, there's a law of nature that overrules perhaps what the government is saying. If let me say, I'm glad that Hope said this, because Hope once told me one thing, and she said Lucretia Mott, the great Quaker, the great pacifist, said to the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, you don't have to really know your scripture to know the difference between right and wrong. So I think that kind of cuts through it, and the government isn't always right.
What a perfect segue. You mentioned Emerson and Thoreau, and we have a question from Anthony, who writes that Whitman, Emerson, and Thoreau all seem to praise Brown for his actions publicly after his hanging, and he says he believes Whitman was actually present at the hanging. Um,
That may be true.
that was a
Yeah.
parenthetical anyway,
Yeah.
but he wants to know, were they abolitionists in general, or did Brown's actions drive them to praise him?
Well, that word abolitionist, I've come to realize, is a very tricky word. And what does it mean? Were they anti-slavery? Did they believe in the immediate ending of slavery? Absolutely. And long before John Brown became famous, they were writing about this, and I love now, I forget, I think it was Emerson who said, um, it's the slaveholder that makes the abolitionist. What right do you have to complain about abolitionists? Yes. So, uh, I forgot what the question was.
It was a question about whether John Brown influenced. It sounds like they were
Oh,
already, agree, some
yes. So,
definition, abolitionists even before John Brown.
and that's a great question, because yes, they had those beliefs before that. And like Thoreau believed, this, all we need is one person who believes and sees this and who will take action and whatever, and we can solve this. And so they had all these ideas before John Brown came along. And when they met John Brown in 1857, I think it was like, oh, here he is. Here is the man we've been looking for. Because they weren't necessarily taking much action. They weren't. They were philosophers.
Yeah.
But here's the man who comes from the country, who's in touch with nature, right? Who lives in nature, and who is willing to take action on his principles.
Well, we have about 5 minutes left and still a handful of questions, so we'll go
Okay.
kind of rapid fire through
All
these.
right.
George asked what your take was on the Russell Banks book about Brown, and we covered that already. I'll remind people that you can go back and this interview, and he may well have joined us late, but that was a fairly early question in our conversation. But the Adirondack Experience will have this interview up on their YouTube page within a day or two after we're done here.
Okay.
Nolan asks, how did the memory of John Brown at the farm change in the aftermath of his death and in the creation of the state historic site?
I think it changed more after the Browns left the farm, because then it wasn't like their house anymore. Now it was like this memory thing, and was purchased by Kate Field and a group of people specifically to preserve that memory. But here I'm gonna like really put in this zinger at the last minute. Guess what? There's a second book coming with the whole history of that. It will
No
be
spoilers.
coming out in April or May, and it will be the history of the John Brown farm from basically 1864 up to today.
Well, and the Brown family leaves in 1864. Jen asks, she says, I'm curious about John Brown's family's history after he died and what their legacy is today.
So there are a couple of great books out there about what happens in California, and all of their later works out there. And I don't know, most of them ended up being buried out in California. Mary is buried out in California, although she kind of wanted to be buried here, but that didn't work out. Um, so there are other books that talk about that
Okay.
subject.
Earl, our correspondent from Kansas, follows up with a question. Have you ever been to Kansas? And, I don't know whether that question is specifically as you're researching John Brown or just in general.
Well, I went to a lot of the John Brown sites. I did not make it to Kansas, so I'm looking forward to getting there at some point, and to getting to California. Yes.
Faye asks, well, she writes, I also have a home in Essex County in the Adirondacks. Farming would seem to be difficult with all the rocks and trees and cold and a short growing season. How did John fare, or John Brown's family fare as farmers?
Well, it turns out that's kind of another kind of general myth of, oh, farming's horrible in the Adirondacks, but there are certain areas where farming in the Adirondacks is very good, and has been for centuries, along like the Ausable River Valley in North Alba, and along the Saranac Valley, along the Lake Champlain, et cetera, and whatever. And so, yes, that little area where they are there on what's called the tablelands or such was somewhat fertile.
Somewhat.
Somewhat.
It wasn't
They made out as
Kansas.
well as some of their other neighbors did.
Yeah.
Yes.
Earl follows up by saying, I live in Lawrence and would be happy to show you around.
Okay.
um, uh, One person earlier asked the question, I think it was Maria, wanted to know if you had had a chance to meet Alice Green. And Neil also asked the question about how large the Black community in North Elba and environs is now. And I think those two questions are probably related somewhat.
I did know Alice Green, and I previously did a book about remarkable women of the Adirondacks called Breaking Trail, in which one of the chapters highlights Alice Green. And so I met her and interviewed her, and wrote that chapter. So you might want to look up that book. But Alice, yes, Alice was just one of the kindest, most wonderful, intelligent women that I know, and she did great work. And as far as the community now, I don't know the exact numbers. I can't judge. Yeah, I'm sorry, I just don't know. At the
Yeah.
time, there were, as I say, there were at the most 50 to 60 black settlers in North Alba back in the 1850 time period.
We were very fortunate to have Alice as a guest on this interview series, and I know she talked a lot about sort of the latter history of black settlement in the Adirondacks. So I'd also encourage people. I think it was early last season, so that would be season 2 of the series, and I think you should still be able to find that online as well. There are a handful of questions that I don't think we're going to have time to get to, unfortunately. But I guess I wanted to ask you one question to kind of tie this all together, and that is, what are the pieces of the puzzle that are still missing? The details of John Brown's life and his family's life in North Elba that have thus far still been lost to memory.
Well, I'm trying to still piece together exactly where Ruth and Henry lived. They stayed there when the John Brown went to Ohio. Sorry, and so I'm still trying to piece together where they were exactly from 1851 to 1855. I'm still trying to piece together the movements of the sons in North Alba. They seem to have rented some farming lots, and so it turns out that the Browns have a bigger footprint actually on acreage and lots within North Alba than we previously thought. I'm what else am I still? I'm still just trying to find more letters and more information about their interactions and such. Absolutely. And I guess around like why they left also, I kind of know why they left, but um it'd be great to know more details about that.
So maybe this is a trilogy.
Oh geez. Oh no. Let's get the first two out there and we'll see. Well, actually, I'm kind of ongoing with new discoveries on that website I mentioned, johnbrownny.com, that I plan to, as I discover new things to put that out there.
And I imagine people who have sort of lingering questions might be able to reach out to you through that website.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes. There's
Well,
a blog post there, yeah.
the book is really interesting. It's called John Brown in New York: The Man, His Family, and the
Ah,
Adirondack
yes.
Landscape. Sandra Weber, thank you so much. It was really a delight to chat with you, and then things back to Liz Bellier. And there
Yes,
she is.
thank you. Thank you both. And thank you all of you for joining us tonight. And we invite you to join us again on Monday, February 2nd, when we welcome author Giles Blunt for a discussion on his work of historical fiction, Bad Juliet. And we are also delighted to share that our winter Zoom series with the Albany Public Library returns next week. We began on Wednesday, January 14th, with historian Connor Williams, who will be presenting Greetings from the Great Camps, the History of the Adirondack Vacation. As always, these programs are free, though registration is required. Sandra and Mitch, thank you so much again. And on behalf of all of us at the Adirondack Experience, I'm Liz Bellier. Thank you for spending your evening with us. And until next time, good night.
Be safe out there.
Thank you.